Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? I'm Professor Eric Chafee, and on behalf of myself and Juliet Kostritsky, we're the co-directors of the Business Law Center. I am excited to welcome you today to the Norman A. Sugarman Tax Lecture. It's an event that celebrates the life and work of Norman A. Sugarman. Sugarman was born in Cleveland and attended Western Reserve University, where he earned his Bachelor of Arts degree from Adelbert College in 1938. And his JD from the School of Law in 1940. He was a member of both Phi Beta Kappa and Order of the Corinth, and after a distinguished career with the Internal Revenue Service, he joined Baker Hostetler as a partner in 1954. Mr. Sugarman passed away in 1986, but his impact on tax law continues, including this lecture series. As part of the lecture series, we are excited to welcome Daniel Himmel. He is the John S.R. Shad Professor of Law at NYU School of Law. His wide-ranging research explores topics in taxation, intellectual property, administrative and constitutional law, and nonprofit organizations. He's published more than 50 scholarly articles and essays in law reviews and economic journals, including in the Columbia Law Review, the Stanford Law Review, Yale Law Journal, Journal of Economic Perspectives, and National Tax Journal. His academic work has been cited by the U.S. Supreme Court, multiple federal courts of appeals, and the Presidential Commission on the Supreme Court of the United States. Mr. Himmel graduated summa cum laude from Harvard College and earned a Master of Philosophy with distinction in International Relations at the University of Oxford, where he was a Marshall Scholar. He then earned his JD from Yale Law School, where he was editor-in-chief of the Yale Law Journal. After law school, he served as visiting counsel on the Joint Committee on Taxation and clerked for the U.S. Court of Appeals for the First Circuit and the District of Columbia. He also clerked for Associate Justice Elena Kagan on the U.S. Supreme Court. He has held visiting professorships at Harvard, Stanford, and Yale law schools. Before joining NYU in 2022, he served for 7 years on the University of Chicago faculty, where he was the professor of law and Ronald H. Coase research scholar. And we're excited to have him here today and really looking forward to this lecture.
Thank you for having me here. My grandfather was a Western Reserve alum. He also loved animals. He did not love taxes. He would have been more proud if I had gone here, but he would have been proud to know that I made it here in some form. The date was December 15th, 1941, 1 week after U.S. entry into World War II, and Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau, pictured in the center, gathered his closest advisors to puzzle through a vexing problem. The war effort would require money, many tens of billions of dollars, which meant that Morgenthau's Treasury Department would have to collect large amounts in tax revenue from millions of Americans who had never filed an income tax return before. What had once been a class tax, a levy falling largely on the rich, would need to be transformed into a mass tax that applied across the income spectrum. But for the mass tax to fulfill its revenue-raising potential, someone would have to educate ordinary Americans about their tax filing obligations and convince them that tax paying was a patriotic duty rather than an avoidable nuisance. At Morgenthau's meeting with his advisors that morning, Assistant Secretary John L. Sullivan spoke up with an outside-the-box idea. What John Barrymore can't do, Sullivan suggested, maybe Mickey Mouse could. Perhaps America's most lovable and relatable rodent could popularize the notion of income tax reporting. If mice filed their returns, maybe men would too. The Treasury Department reached out to Walt Disney, whose production studio kicked into high gear. But the creative geniuses at Disney decided that Mickey Mouse was not right for the role. Instead, they cast Donald Duck, voiced by Clarence Nash, as the star of the 7-minute film titled The New Spirit. Morgenthau initially resisted, suggesting that the film should feature a human character, whom he dubbed Mr. Average Taxpayer. But an angry Walt Disney replied, "I've given you Donald Duck. At our studio, that's the equivalent of giving you Clark Gable out of the MGM stable. Morgenthau acquiesced, and The New Spirit hit theaters on January 23rd, 1942, a remarkable 5 weeks from inception to box office release. The New Spirit was a smash hit. Between the movie's debut and the tax filing deadline, a whopping 32 million Americans saw the film. That's an especially remarkable number once one remembers that in 1942, Americans could not yet stream movies on YouTube. Indeed, they couldn't even mooch off their parents' Netflix subscriptions. According to a Gallup poll, 37% of Americans said that The New Spirit had fostered their willingness to pay taxes. The movie was nominated for Best Documentary Feature at the 15th Academy Awards, a particularly stunning achievement given that the film's plotline, involving a tax-paying mallard who claims Huey, Dewey, and Louie as dependents on his return, is about as far from a documentary as one could imagine. The film has rightfully earned its place in fiscal history as the crown jewel of tax propaganda. The notion that a duck would prove central to the making of the modern fiscal state might strike some as, well, goofy. Yet Donald Duck's part in the popularization of the income tax is of a piece with the role that animals have played in taxation for many millennia. Non-human animals, real animals rather than cartoon characters, have enabled tax authorities to extract resources from their subjects for at least 5,000 years. And along the way, taxation has shaped and continues to reshape the relationship between humans and the rest of the animal kingdom. 30 years ago, Judge Frank Easterbrook derided the emerging field of cyber law as the law of the horse. As Easterbrook put it, lots of cases deal with horses. Some cases deal with people kicked by horses, still more deal with the licensing and racing of horses. Any effort to collect these strands into a law of the horse is doomed to be shallow and to miss unifying principles. Now, if the law of the horse is doomed to incoherence, then one might fear that the tax law of the horse, or of animals more broadly, will suffer a similar fate. My goal today is to convince you, though, that this is not the case. The tax law of animals is historically, theoretically, and doctrinally deep. It reflects, if not unifying principles, at least unifying themes. Furthermore, careful study of the relationship between animals and taxation over time can shed light on tax law's potential role in addressing one of the major moral crises of our time, the extraordinary abuse that humans inflict upon billions of factory-farmed animals each year. Of course, we should not expect the tax law of animals to be entirely coherent, because human attitudes toward animals are not entirely coherent. In the United States, we love dogs and eat pigs, even though pigs are, by most measures, the smarter of the two animals. The National Football League suspended Atlanta Falcons cornerback Michael Vick for dogfighting, a practice that the league deemed to be cruel and reprehensible, even as every NFL game is played with a ball made from the skin of a steer that has been castrated without anesthesia. And Donald Duck is, as noted, a national icon, but if Donald lived on a foie gras farm, we would shove a metal tube down his throat and force-feed him until his liver grew to 10 times its normal size. Similar tensions define the relationship between taxation and non-human animals. Tax systems historically have adopted 4, sometimes incompatible images of animals. First, as sources of income and wealth. Second, as luxury accoutrements. Third, as generators of external harm. And fourth and finally, as ends in themselves. In this lecture, I will trace each of these 4 images through tax history, explain how tax systems have affected, and in some cases directed, the evolution of human-animal relations, and last but not least, reflect on the role that tax tools might play in reducing the amount of suffering that humans inflict upon non-human animals every day. The taxation of animals as sources of income and wealth may be as old as taxation itself. Clay tablets from ancient Mesopotamia record the payment of tax in the form of livestock as early as 3000 BC. By 2000 BC, the Sumerian city of Ur had developed an intricate system of livestock taxation. Each of the 24 core provinces paid a tax to the crown equal to 10% of all sheep, goats, and cattle. Soldiers who settled farther flung regions were similarly required to send live sheep, goats, and cattle, and sometimes wild animals such as gazelles, to the Royal Collection Center. As objects of taxation and vehicles of wealth extraction, livestock carried several administrative advantages. Livestock tend to be easy to count and hard to hide. Counting sheep puts many people to sleep, in part because it is so straightforward. Furthermore, livestock, unlike fruits and grains, can move on their own. Collecting taxes in the form of livestock allowed the ancient Sumerians to shift resources from the periphery to the city center. Animal taxation also allowed rulers in royal capitals to extend their power outwards. In the Incan Empire, which relied on taxes in the form of llamas and alpacas, the possibility of meat on the hoof, as anthropologist Noah Corcoran-Tad puts it, was central to Cusco's ability to project force across the length of the Andes. Taxation in the form of livestock did pose one serious administrative challenge for the ancient fiscal state. To quote the porcine ruler Napoleon from George Orwell's Animal Farm, "All animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others." Even within species, some individual animals may be more or less valuable on account of age or health status, and the relative value of individual animals may be difficult for tax collectors to assess. When, for example, the state required taxpayers to remit 1 out of every 10 animals as a tax or a tithe, there was a risk that taxpayers would choose the sickliest from their flock to satisfy their payment obligation. The ancient Israelite solution to this tax administrative challenge is reflected in Leviticus 27:32. "All tithes of herd and flock, every 10th one that passes under the shepherd's staff, shall be holy to the Lord." According to the medieval Jewish scholar Rashi, the Israelites implemented the Levitical command as follows. When the tithe collector arrived each year, the shepherd was required to let the lambs and calves born that year out of their pens through a gate one by one, striking every 10th animal with a rod that had been painted with a red dye. The dyed animals would then be taken to the temple. For tithes of fruit and grain, farmers had the option to pay in silver shekels rather than in kind. But because individual animals were more difficult to value, Levitical law provided no opportunity for substitute payment of the livestock tithe. The taxation of animals played a similarly central role in the development of the early Islamic fiscal state. In 7th century Arabia, the zakat, or religiously mandated almsgiving, was paid in the form of livestock, with a cliff-like bracket structure. According to the legal scholar Ahmed Taha, if a person owed less than 40 sheep, no zakat was owed. The zakat was 1 sheep for someone owning between 40 and 120 sheep, and 2 sheep for someone owning between 121 and 200 sheep. According to Professor Taha, the structure of the zakat, like the Levitical livestock tithe, carried certain administrative advantages. Zakat collectors could see a person's livestock or inventory much easily than they would have been able to audit a person's claimed income. Moreover, zakat on livestock was paid in livestock, which relieved liquidity challenges for shepherds in the desert, where it was difficult to find sufficient currency. The primary disadvantage of in-kind payments was that they increased administrative costs, as it was obviously much easier for the zakat collector to receive payments in coins than in sheep, cattle, or camels. The practice of payment in kind, which shifted administrative costs from the individual to the state, reflected the religious roots of the zakat, consistent with the Islamic principle that acts of worship should not be hardships. In-kind payment of animal-based taxes is almost entirely a thing of the past, though as of March 2025, Lainia County in South Sudan reportedly required cattle herders to pay an in-kind security fee of 4 cows per month. Still, many tax systems continue to conceive of animals as a form of wealth and to tax them as such. For example, West Virginia, as part of its comprehensive personal property tax, imposes a $3 tax on dogs over the age of 6 months, with an additional $3 tax on dogs kept within the municipal limits. Dog owners who pay the tax receive a registration tag. Any dog found without a tag may be impounded by the county dog warden, and if not redeemed within 15 days, either sold off or destroyed. In Pocahontas County, West Virginia, a tax assessor visits every residence between July 1st and October 1st to count the number of dogs on premises. One factor facilitating enforcement is that dogs bark. Interestingly, West Virginia does not extend its personal property tax to cats, perhaps because, as an administrative matter, taxes on cats are harder to enforce due to the greater quietude of felines. Now, tax law's second image of animals is as luxury accoutrements. One of the first examples of luxury tax on animals is the English dog tax of 1796. By the late 18th century, according to the historian Ingrid Tague, there was already a well-established practice of taxing luxuries, from men servants to hair powder. Combined with the specific circumstances of the period, widespread food shortages, anxieties about rabies, and a government interested in raising revenue wherever it could be found, the dog tax's luxury tax won sufficient support for passage. But as Tague observes, presenting a tax on dogs as a luxury tax created as many problems as it solved, as there were deep divisions about how to define a dog as a luxury. The compromise ultimately reached in Parliament was to impose a 5-shilling tax on specific breeds of hunting dogs, including greyhounds, pointers, setters, spaniels, and terriers. Owners of other dogs, such as lap dogs, faced a 3-shilling tax, except that low-income dog owners, generally those who lived in houses with fewer than 7 windows, could keep one lap dog tax-free. While the 1796 dog tax was styled as a luxury tax, not as a tax designed to advance animal welfare, arguments about animal cruelty figured prominently in the debates leading up to its passage. One proponent of the tax, Edward Berry, argued that passing a tax on dogs would not only help society, it would actually help dogs by discouraging low-income Englanders from keeping hounds who they were ill-equipped to house and feed. But as opponents of the tax noted, Berry's own rationale relied on the assumption that the tax would lead to the mass destruction of dogs. John Courtenay, a member of the House of Commons from the Whig Party, worried that the widespread extermination of dogs would have negative consequences not only for canines but also for humans. Courtenay told his fellow parliamentarians to accustom the people to look with hard-hearted indifference on the murder of these faithful animals would debase their moral feelings. Just as the luxury tax rationale swayed the English Parliament in the late 18th century, so too did it lead to the adoption of dog levies across the Russian Empire in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1864, Tsar Alexander II, pictured here with his dog, granted municipal authorities in Riga the right to impose an experimental 3-ruble tax on dogs with an exemption for skippers, shepherds, and night watchmen. In other words, dog owners who use their canines for work rather than pleasure. By the turn of the 20th century, municipal dog taxes had proliferated across the Russian Empire, becoming a critical source of revenue for cash-strapped cities in the final days of the Romanov reign. Today, the distinction between animals as sources of income and animals as items of luxury plays an important role in U.S. federal income tax case law. The Internal Revenue Code allows taxpayers to deduct the ordinary and necessary expenses of a trade or business, but Section 183, the hobby loss provision, disallows deductions for any activity that is not engaged in for profit. Thousands of horse owners have sought to deduct expenses associated with their breeding, riding, and racing activities, often galloping headlong into an IRS audit. As the longtime tax court judge Mark Holmes writes, horse farm cases come in herds and not in single stallions, and are among the most frequently litigated under Section 183. In some cases, a taxpayer's treatment of his or her animals can be a factor in whether an activity is classified as a trade or business or as a hobby. For example, in Huff versus Commissioner, a multimillionaire asset manager who also owned a miniature donkey breeding business testified that he did not cuddle or pet his donkeys. Indeed, he thought they were quite ugly and derived no satisfaction from keeping them around. The tax court concluded that Mr. Huff's cool personal feelings toward the miniature donkeys supported its finding that the breeding operation was a trade or business. In other cases, courts have cited the fact that taxpayers culled, i.e. killed, unprofitable animals as a factor favoring trade or business classification. Still, the tax court has emphasized that animal cruelty cannot transform a hobby into a trade or business. For example, in White Cabbage versus Commissioner, the court held that the taxpayer, himself an IRS revenue agent with a sideline as a greyhound breeder, was engaged in a hobby notwithstanding the seemingly inhumane manner in which he kept numerous dogs confined in crates in a garage while he worked a full-time job at the IRS. Tax law's third image of animals is as generators of external harms. Illustratively, many U.S. jurisdictions adopted dog taxes in response to widespread concerns about rabies in the 19th century, requiring dogs to wear collars as evidence that the tax had been paid. In 1880, the New Zealand government imposed an annual 10-shilling dog tax to address a different canine-generated threat: the risk that dogs kept by the Maori would attack cattle and sheep belonging to white ranchers and shepherds. Hundreds of Maori on New Zealand's North Island pledged to take up arms to resist the tax, and the leader of the indigenous resistance, Hone Toia, reportedly objected that if dogs were to be taxed, then men would be next. The government responded by dispatching 120 troops in a gunboat. The Maori ultimately surrendered before human blood was shed. The episode would go down in New Zealand history as the Hokianga Dog Tax Uprising, the last armed rebellion against the crown in the 19th century. These 19th century levies are examples of Pigouvian taxes, taxes designed to make payers internalize the true social cost of harm-generating activities. Jurisdictions around the world continue to fashion new Pigouvian taxes on animals. For example, at the start of this year, the northern Italian city of Bolzano introduced a daily tax of €1.50 on tourists who bring dogs into the municipality. Revenues will be used to clean up dog waste that had previously littered city streets. The tax replaces a previous regime that required DNA testing for all dogs in Bolzano, which was intended to allow authorities to trace dog poop back to the canine from whom it came. Denmark, for its part, is poised to introduce its own tax on scatological externalities emanating from animals. Starting in 2030, it will impose a tax of 300 kroner, or approximately $46, per ton of carbon dioxide equivalent expelled by cows, sheep, and pigs through their feces and flatulence. Now, rhetorically, Pigouvian taxes on animals differ from taxes that treat animals as sources of wealth or luxury. In practice, these different images of animals in tax law often overlap. For example, in turn of the 20th century Russia, rabies concerns converged with the luxury tax rationale for adopting dog taxes. In Bolzano, a dog tax justified primarily on Pigouvian grounds also serves as a means of extracting additional revenue from tourists for whom canines are a luxury travel accessory. Tax law's fourth and final image of animals is as ends in themselves, as sentient beings deserving of affection and protection. As we saw, animal protection was one of the rationales that Edward Berry advanced for the 1796 English dog tax. Nearly a century later, in 1894, New York enacted a $2 tax on all dogs within the New York City limits, and empowered the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, to collect the revenues. According to the 1894 law, the fees so collected shall be applied by said society in maintaining a shelter for lost, strayed, or homeless animals. Any leftover funds could be used by the ASPCA to enforce the state's penal statutes proscribing animal mistreatment. A Brooklyn resident named Lillian Nikia challenged the tax on the ground that it violated the 14th Amendment, arguing that she had a right to own a dog without paying a fee to a private corporation. A unanimous U.S. Supreme Court upheld the tax, reasoning that property in dogs is of an imperfect or qualified nature, and they may be subject to peculiar and drastic police regulations by the state without depriving their owners of any federal right. This fourth image of animals as ends in themselves achieved its clearest expression in U.S. tax law with the Revenue Act of 1918, in which Congress explicitly recognized the prevention of cruelty to animals as a basis for the charitable contribution deduction and exemption. Remarkably, the 1918 amendment was enacted without any serious debate. The idea that animal protection merited a tax subsidy was apparently uncontroversial among lawmakers a century ago. As the leading tax treatise notes, there have been few rulings on what in fact constitutes the prevention of cruelty under sections 170 and 501c3. Still, more than 28,000 organizations have obtained 501c3 exemptions by claiming animal protection and welfare as their primary purpose. But the category of animal cruelty prevention is not infinitely elastic. For example, in a 2015 private letter ruling, the IRS determined that an organization that provided cats and dogs with a heated spa, treadmills, and massages, all for a fee, could not qualify for exemption even though it planned to use its proceeds to educate the public on the benefits of neutering and spaying animals. Perhaps the most famous, and almost certainly the most tragic, litigated case regarding the prevention of cruelty to animals is Van Dusen versus Commissioner, decided by the tax court in 2011. The petitioner in that case, an Oakland attorney named Jan Elizabeth Van Dusen, volunteered for an organization called Fix Our Ferals that specialized in neutering wild cats. According to the tax court, Van Dusen devoted essentially her entire life outside of work to caring for cats. And by 2004, she had between 70 and 80 cats living in her 1,500 square foot home. For tax year 2004, she sought to deduct $12,068 in out-of-pocket costs as charitable contributions to Fix Our Ferals. The IRS disallowed the deductions on the ground that Van Dusen was an independent cat rescue worker whose work did not benefit Fix Our Ferals. The tax court disagreed. According to the court, Van Dusen's care for foster cats constituted services to Fix Our Ferals, allowing her to deduct incidental expenses as contributions to a corporation organized and operated exclusively for the prevention of cruelty to animals. Now, 4 months after the favorable tax court ruling, Oakland police executed a search warrant at Van Dusen's home on suspicion that, far from preventing cruelty to animals, Van Dusen was engaged in animal abuse. Police found feces everywhere and 93 live cats roaming the premises, along with 11 dead ones inside Van Dusen's freezer. Of the 93 live cats, 18 were so sick that they had to be euthanized. The Alameda County District Attorney charged Van Dusen with 1 count of felony cruelty, and after her first trial ended in a hung jury, she was ultimately convicted and sentenced to 5 years probation. If there is a broader lesson of the Van Dusen saga, it is that the tax system's image of animals does not always align with the images projected and perceived by other areas of law. The case also points us toward the many moral ambiguities of animal cruelty prevention. From the prosecutor's perspective, Jan Elizabeth Van Dusen is a cat killer who stuffs her victims inside freezers. To her defenders, she is a friend of the felines whose home, for all its hygienic shortcomings, still provided its cat residents with a welcome haven from Oakland's alleyways. So far, I have sought to show how tax law reflects 4 different images of animals: as sources of income and wealth, as luxuries, as generators of harm, and as ends in themselves. Along the way, we have seen how animals contributed to the rise of the fiscal state, how the taxation of animals enabled the Sumerians, the Incas, and other ancient regimes to extract wealth and project power. Yet not only did animals play a leading role in the rise of taxation, but taxation has redefined the relationship between humans and animals. Tax systems not only have reflected our images of animals, but have remade them. Perhaps the clearest illustration of this phenomenon is in the case of pigs in the Middle East. As archaeologist Max Price notes, The ancient Sumerians kept pigs, but Sumerian city-states struggled to tax pigs. As compared to cattle and camels, pigs, and especially piglets, are much easier to hide from tax collectors. Moreover, pigs are much more difficult to transport over long distances. As price rights, states and their institutions encourage the production of the types of resources that are most quantifiable and amenable to large-scale coordinated management. Ruminants and equids fit this description. Pigs do not. One solution to the challenge of taxing pigs was to invoke the power of taboo. If rulers could convince their subjects that pig meat was unclean or even immoral, they could reduce the risk that subjects would evade their fiscal obligations by substituting away from taxed animals and toward untaxable swine. Today, the term pork barrel is used in American English to refer to government largesse, but at least according to one theory, pig rearing in the pre-modern Middle East was inimical to the fiscal state, and the status of the pig in Middle Eastern religions such as Judaism and Islam is traceable to the exigencies of tax administration. Economist Peter Leeson has proposed an alternative theory of the pork taboo, one that likewise places taxation at the center. According to Leeson, advances in agriculture and irrigation in the late Iron Age led to the rise of large-scale crop production, which benefited priests because farmers paid a proportionate tithe to the Judean clergy. Pigs, meanwhile, posed a unique threat to large-scale crop production. When pigs use their snouts to dig into the soil in search of roots, tubers, worms, and insects, they uproot crops completely, destroy irrigation lines, and disturb soil structure. By contrast, cattle, sheep, and goats mainly eat grass and leaves, removing vegetation without plowing up the soil. According to Leeson, the Judean pig ban emerged as a means of protecting the priest's source of tax revenue from the porcine threat. According to Leeson, priests invoked God to enjoin involvement with pigs because a supernatural injunction was cheaper to enforce than a natural one. In a land of faithful Hebrews, God's swine prohibition enforced itself. Now, if either of these theories is right, then taxation goes a long way toward explaining the historical relationship between humans and pigs in Abrahamic religions and cultures. Tax law has also played an important role in shaping the relationship between man and man's best friend. The first breeder of Doberman pinschers, Carl Friedrich Louis Doberman, was a 19th century German tax official who developed the breed with the idea that his dogs could accompany him on his sometimes dangerous and often lonely tax collection rounds. And tax law's impact on dogs extends well beyond a single breed. As the historian Anton Kontenko observes, the Russian government in the late Romanov period played an active role in changing human-dog relations, forcing people to take more formal legal responsibility for their four-legged companions by paying tax and fitting them with collars, tags, or muzzles. The administrative requirements of 19th and 20th century dog taxes reinforced the idea that every dog in an urban area must be traceable to a human owner. A more recent example of taxation structuring human-animal relations comes from U.S. federal tax law. In the 1970s and early 1980s, a combination of high marginal rates, favorable depreciation rules, and the availability of the investment tax credit made Arabian horses the tax shelter of choice for thousands of high-income Americans. The number of purebred Arabian horses in the United States grew from fewer than 100 in the early 20th century to 300,000 by 1984. But then the Tax Reform Act of 1986 slashed the top marginal rate, eliminated the investment tax credit, and imposed strict new limits on passive activity losses. As Judge Holmes recounts, the bubble burst and the Arabian horse market, like the markets for many other breeds, collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of horses, lacking commercial value, were slaughtered across the United States. Many were sold off for horse meat. As the pig taboo, dog tax, and Arabian horse examples all show, taxation has defined and redefined human-animal relations for millennia. In the remaining minutes of this lecture, I'll ask whether tax law can do so once more. Can tax law play a productive role in addressing the moral crisis of factory farming, a practice that has transformed the once intimate human-animal relationship into a system of mechanized cruelty? Now, my guess is that few will contest the normative premise implicit in that question, that there is something deeply wrong, indeed many things deeply wrong, with the present state of American animal agriculture. Whether we are strict vegans or place meat at the very top of our personal food pyramid, most of us would prefer for animals on U.S. factory farms to be treated with greater humanity. To highlight just a few of the enormities. Most U.S. broiler chickens are bred to gain weight so quickly that by the end of their 45-day lives, they can barely walk. 99% of the 9 billion broiler chickens raised and slaughtered in the U.S. each year will spend their entire lives indoors, in chronic contact with ammonia-laden feces that leaves painful necrotic ulcers on their skin. At the end of their short lives, they will be hung upside down by their legs and shot through an electric stun bath before their throats are slit, a practice known as live shackle slaughter. It works most of the time, but if chickens flap their wings or raise their heads during the stun bath, they may still be conscious when the knife reaches their necks. Most pigs in the United States will similarly spend their lives indoors. Many see sunlight for the first time on the day of their slaughter. Male piglets are typically castrated without anesthesia. Gestating sows are confined to 7 by 2 foot metal crates that restrict their movement so severely that they cannot turn around. Most U.S. pigs end their conscious lives in high concentration gas chambers, where they often gasp and squeal for up to 90 seconds before succumbing. Now, the lives of cattle in the United States are comparatively pleasant next to chickens and pigs, though still far from the pastoral utopia of Margaret Wise Brown's Big Red Barn. Beef cattle spend the beginning of their lives on open pasture, but they typically wind up in large feedlots where they stand in their own waste while they are stuffed with grain-heavy diets that their digestive systems are ill-equipped to process. Dairy cattle face a different set of indignities. Dairy calves in the United States are removed from their mothers at birth, a separation that produces documented distress responses in both mother and calf. Female dairy cows are kept in a near-permanent cycle of artificial insemination, pregnancy, and lactation. Their male offspring are sold off for ground beef if they are lucky, and for veal if they are not. Now, what role, if any, might tax law play in reducing the scale and severity of this suffering? It may be helpful to classify interventions into 4 categories. On the left side are taxes, or similar to taxes, regulations backed by civil penalties. On the right side are negative taxes, in other words, subsidies. In the top left corner are taxes aimed at particular animal husbandry practices. One example is Belgium's tax on the use of veterinary antibiotics. The primary purpose of the tax is to slow the development of antibiotic-resistant bacteria that can spread to humans. But by making it more expensive to pump animals with antibiotics, the tax incentivizes factory farms to reduce stocking densities and improve hygiene so that animals get sick less often. In the bottom left corner are taxes aimed at particular products. For example, my NYU law colleague Katrina Wyman and co-authors have proposed a meat tax that would fall on beef, chicken, pork, and other animal products in proportion to their greenhouse gas emissions. Economists Romain Espinosa and Nicholas Traish at Toulouse School of Economics have advocated an animal welfare levy calibrated to internalize the costs of suffering inflicted in the meat production process. Wyman's meat tax would fall more heavily on beef than on chicken and pork because beef is about 10 times worse than chicken and 8 times worse than pork in terms of greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram of food product. Espinosa and Traish's tax would fall more heavily on chicken and pork than on beef because chicken and pork production typically involves much more suffering for the same amount of food, both because beef cattle are comparatively well treated and because of what the animal welfare literature refers to as the small body problem. It takes more than 200 broiler chickens to produce the same amount of meat as one beef cow. In the top right corner are subsidies, negative taxes, aimed at particular practices. One real-world example is the European Union's subsidy for the adoption of in ovo sexing technology. Because broiler chickens have been specially bred to gain weight so quickly, male chicks from egg-laying breeds are commercially useless. In the United States, industrial hatcheries deal with this problem by literally throwing day-old male chicks into a meat grinder or macerator and then using them as animal feed. The remains of cold male chicks often end up feeding the next generation of broiler chickens and layer hens. In other countries, governments have encouraged, and in some cases required, hatcheries to use spectroscopy and other methods to identify and abort male chicken embryos before they hatch, thus sparing day-old male chicks from a particularly gruesome death. The cost is approximately 1 cent per table egg. Subsidies have accelerated the development and adoption of in ovo sexing in other countries, though here in the US, fewer than 1% of eggs undergo in ovo sexing, and approximately 300 million male chicks are thrown into macerators each year. In the bottom right corner are subsidies aimed at particular products. Subsidies for plant-based and lab-grown meat might fall into this fourth category. In the past 2 decades, the US Department of Agriculture has spent only $124 million to support plant-based proteins, roughly 0.2% of what it has spent on subsidies for livestock and seafood production. In other words, by promoting meat and fish over plant-based protein, negative taxes already, but perversely, shape the human-animal relationship. The advantage of intervening on the left side through taxation is fiscal. Taxes raise money, and with a federal deficit of $2 trillion, raising money is obviously preferable to losing it. The advantage of intervening on the right side through negative taxes is political. At a time when affordability is a buzzword, subsidies that reduce food costs will be more palatable to voters than taxes that inflate grocery bills. The advantage of intervening on the top row, targeting practices rather than products, is that agricultural practices may be easier to change than consumer choices. Industrial hatcheries will almost certainly adopt in ovo sexing long before Americans switch from egg omelets to tofu scramble. The case for intervening on the bottom row, targeting products rather than practices, will be most compelling to animal agriculture abolitionists who object to all meat, dairy, and egg production on deontological grounds. For them, practices such as in ovo sexing result in the humane washing of an inevitably barbarous system. Debating the optimal mix of tax and negative tax interventions from this 2x2 matrix would keep us here well into the night. To close, I want to connect the immediate issue of factory farming to the long history of animals and taxation. First, the idea of using the tax system to advance animal welfare is not newfangled. As we have seen, tax law's image of animals as ends in themselves predates the Revenue Act of 1918, predates even the 1894 New York City dog tax that earmarked revenues for the ASPCA, and extends at least as far back as the English dog tax debates of the late 1700s. And second, reformers who seek to deploy tax tools for animal welfare ends will inevitably confront other images of animals in taxation that have endured for centuries, or in some cases, millennia. Most straightforwardly, the use of tax law to advance animal welfare will have to contend with the image of animals as sources of income and wealth. The U.S. meat and poultry industry directly employs more than 500,000 workers, generating over $40 billion in labor income and $13 billion in federal, state, and local taxes. Those numbers look large in absolute terms, but in the scheme of the entire U.S. economy, the meat and poultry industry directly accounts for only about 0.3% of all jobs and a similar fraction of labor income. Somewhat ironically, industrialization has radically shrunk the economic footprint of animal agriculture and reduced the number of voters whose livelihoods are directly tied to meat and poultry. The success of efforts to use tax law for animal welfare ends will depend in important part on whether reformers can reframe meat as a luxury rather than a staple. The 18th century English dog tax proponents made much of the fact that dogs consumed food that could otherwise sustain starving humans. One could make a similar argument about the inefficiency of meat. Beef requires 7 grams of feed protein per gram of edible protein. The ratio is 4-to-1 for pork and 3-to-1 for chicken. Beef, chicken, and pork are, in fact, extraordinarily inefficient means of satisfying rising protein demands. The history of dog taxes shows how tax tools can shape perceptions of luxury and necessity. It remains to be seen whether taxes on animal agriculture can do so again. Finally, reformers who seek to advance animal welfare through the tax system will have to contend with the image of animals as generators of external harm. To be sure, sometimes Bourguibian tax rationales and animal welfare rationales align. The Belgian veterinary antibiotic tax is one possible example, though even in that case, there is a risk that the tax might induce farmers to withhold antibiotics from animals who are genuinely sick. But there is a deep tension between policies designed to address the external harms of animal agriculture, most notably greenhouse gas emissions, and policies designed to advance the interests of animals themselves. For example, pasture-raised eggs generally have higher greenhouse gas emissions per kilogram than conventionally caged eggs, though conventional cages, which confine layer hens to a space 2/3 the size of a single sheet of paper, involve vastly more suffering. And as noted, beef production is roughly 10 times more greenhouse gas intensive than chicken production, though from an animal welfare perspective, beef is far less objectionable than poultry. In other work, Andy Stawash and I have referred to this phenomenon as the climate cruelty trade-off. Policies that might reduce the external harms of animal agriculture are not always best for farmed animals themselves. Inevitably, as we saw before in the Van Dusen case, the use of taxation for animal welfare ends will entail deep moral ambiguities and value conflicts. All of which brings us back to Donald Duck. Donald Duck, after all, is not merely a charming historical footnote. He's a symbol of the extraordinary malleability of human attitudes toward animals and taxes alike. Henry Morgenthau and Walt Disney recognized in 1942 that a cartoon duck could accomplish what armies of tax collectors could not: catalyze a fundamental shift in ordinary Americans' relationship to the fiscal state. The question facing animal welfare advocates today is in some sense the reverse of the one that confronted Morgenthau and Disney. Can the fiscal state catalyze a fundamental shift in Americans' relationship with animals? Can the tools of the fiscal state, taxes as well as subsidies, bring us to treat broiler chickens, gestating sows, and yes, Donald's mallard cousins on foie gras farms, not merely as sources of income and wealth, luxuries, and externalities, but as ends in themselves? Unlike the making of the new spirit, this process will take much longer than 5 weeks, perhaps longer than any of our lifetimes. But millennia of history teach us that taxation has, in times past, remolded human-animal relations. And it is not entirely daffy to hope that tax can do so again. With that, I look forward to your comments, questions, objections. Thanks.
So, absolutely wonderful presentation. I do wonder if there might be a fifth category, though.
Sure.
Something in between basically animals as ends in themselves and animals being luxuries. I wonder if there's also another category which would be animals as a means to human flourishing. And I think about that in regard to a couple of things. In the 501c3 context, you have organizations that provide pet therapy. So the idea is that it's not the animals as an end in of themselves, but to help people. You also see with the healthcare deduction that certain types of service animals are in fact covered by that. And it makes me wonder, if at least part of what you're trying to do is to turn people more towards thinking about animals as an end in themselves, whether or not at least acknowledging that intermediate step might actually be helpful in your cause in terms of doing that.
I love those examples. Yes, there are litigated cases about claiming medical expense deductions for animals. I'll have to give more thought to whether I can trace that back beyond the last few decades. But the history of animals and taxation is deep enough that my guess is yes. So thank you.
I don't need maybe.
It's a small enough.
I mean,
they're doing it.
we can-
Yeah.
I guess perhaps I missed that, but would you mind elaborating on the last trade-off you're mentioning between addressing external harms and treating animals as an end of themselves? Maybe it's in this other work of yours. How do you, like, on prescriptively or normatively, how do you suggest to address this trade-off?
Great. To be clear, the trade-off is what we would do in order to reduce CO2 emissions is not necessarily the same as what we would do to reduce animal cruelty. I think this is a fundamental dilemma. Now, there's one solution, which is just become vegan. And tofu is, from an animal cruelty perspective and from a CO2 emissions perspective, way better than beef and chicken. Both my co-author Andy Stawash and I have, in confronting the climate cruelty trade-off, decided that that is our personal approach, but it's not going to happen as a society-wide change. Espinoza and Traish say they try to parameterize the CO2 costs and the animal welfare costs, and they end up concluding that the CO2 costs are very small relative to the animal welfare costs. So it's a climate cruelty trade-off, but cruelty weighs more. To give a sense of the parameterization exercise, if instead of eating an entire broiler chicken, you were to eat the same amount of meat from a cow, the additional climate cost, if we use the Nordhaus social cost of carbon model, would be about $8. And most of us, when we confront or at least when I confront the conditions of broiler chickens, I would think I would pay more than $8 or impose more than $8 of costs on the climate in order for a sentient being to avoid the experience of being a broiler chicken. Now, the big asterisk here is Nordhaus's estimates of the social cost of carbon. William Nordhaus, Yale economist who won a Nobel Prize in part for his estimations of the social cost of carbon, those estimates are anthropocentric. They don't include the social cost of carbon to animals. So it is possible that if we include the social cost of carbon to animals, it's not just an $8 cost of switching from chicken to beef, it's an $800 cost or an $8,000 cost. And we really don't understand what global warming will mean for non-humans. We're not sure what it will mean for humans, but for non-humans as well. That might lead us toward focusing on the bottom right box. I'm not sure whether I want to nudge people from beef to chicken or chicken to beef, but I'd love for them to have more plant-based proteins.
Thinking about like the foot binding tradition using norms of the elites is how they ended up kind of doing away with foot binding. And so I'm wondering, what we do now, because we have a more egalitarian culture that's more spread out. We love celebrities, not just, the Elon Musks of the world. And so we idolize them. We idolize folks, young people are more and more seem to be idolizing those who social media, whether it's TikTok, YouTube shows, I don't know which TikTok from TikTok. But I guess the question is, I'm wondering whether there's a way of then incentivizing propaganda, for lack of a better word, or some kind of social media. Is that the best way of reaching people? And is there a tax mechanism that could incentivize social media proliferation of the normative ends of your agenda, which would be anti-cruelty, anti-specific animals, anti-specific foods, etc.?
We need really not a Henry Morgenthau, we need a Walt Disney of our time to take this on. Interestingly, there are figures in Hollywood who have made animal cruelty a cause, like Joaquin Phoenix talks about it a lot, and it doesn't seem to have moved people along. Consumption in the United States is on the rise, not falling. Maybe that's because it just hasn't been done in an effective way, or those aren't effective messengers. I guess I would say I am reluctant to suggest propaganda as the policy approach, but A, it worked in 1942, and B, there are Supreme Court cases about the beef checkoff. There's a way in which the federal government has been involved in pro-meat propaganda for many decades. So perhaps it's not absurd to imagine a situation in which government resources are being used or tax incentives are being used in a pro-animal propaganda direction as well. It seems improbable given our current regime, though I will note that the Trump administration's record on animal welfare is super interesting. Right? On the one hand, there's the RFK Jr. food pyramid that puts meat at the top. On the other hand, DOJ has made animal welfare enforcement a priority. EPA has radically reduced the amount of animal testing that occurs. PETA sometimes praises the Trump administration, and there's ways in which the Trump administration is the most pro-animal administration we've ever seen.
Maybe it's not so much of an issue because you're focusing on farming practices, but I'm wondering if you foresee with respect to the positive tax measures, any kind of a clash with First Amendment or religious rights in the sense that animals play a role in religious rituals, and someone might say we need to do that this way to observe some kind of religious practice. Do you see any of this in your research?
There are definitely going to be conflicts between religion and animal welfare, though there are also synergies between religion and animal welfare. So there are cases involving prisoners who claim that for religious reasons they need to be vegan, and then they're litigating on RFRA grounds, dietary access cases. I don't think that, for example, a tax on the use of live shackle slaughter would be a First Amendment problem under at least the post-1991, the version of the free exercise clause. But there is a concern, sort of, if you take Employment Division versus Smith seriously, if you take the idea that valid and neutral laws of general applicability satisfy First Amendment scrutiny, then I would think you could target a practice like live shackle slaughter. One reason why animal welfare certification agencies have been reluctant to withhold their highest certified humane labels from chicken processors that engage in live shackle slaughter is there is at least a debate within Orthodox Judaism about whether alternative methods are consistent with the laws of kashrut. In kashrut, an animal needs to be alive at the time of slaughter. There are methods of gassing chickens that are used in Europe that are considered to be more humane, but there's a concern that they would not be consistent with the laws of kashrut. And some European countries have bit that bullet, and there's a famous ECJ, European Court of Justice and European Court of Human Rights case about Belgium's effective ban on kosher slaughter. I'm not sure whether it would be, certainly banning kosher slaughter, banning the law of slaughter would be a First Amendment violation. Incentivizing practices that are potentially inconsistent with some groups' beliefs may be more of a political problem. I guess the two other comments on this, and this is, I think there are a lot of interesting directions to go in animal law, and animal law and religion is one. There's no religion that actually requires you to eat meat. So I'm a somewhat religious Jew and a vegan, and I don't think that's a problem because I'm not required to eat chicken that were killed by a live shackle slaughter. It's just that if I were to eat chicken, then I might need to eat chicken that were alive at the time that their throats were slit. Second, my sense is that a successful animal welfare movement will have to mobilize rather than antagonize religious groups. That religion is such a powerful moral force in the United States, and there's so many resources within the major religions to advance animal welfare claims that, First Amendment aside, animal welfare advocates have to figure out a way of making their claims consonant with major religions.
That was an animal overall.
I mean, that's okay.
So I think we're right at time. Why don't we thank Professor Howard.